That, of course, connected to the story we shared in the first segment, the report from J.P. Morgan forecasting that gas prices will rise by 37%, and they entitled the report "Cruel Summer." So we had to accommodate. Good morning, Mr. Lars Larson, host of the Lars Larson Show. Good to see you. How are you, Lars?
Good to see you as well, Gerard. I got to tell you, I heard your discussion about that. Every time I've been to the Gulf states, the gas prices are just amazingly low compared to where I live in the Pacific Northwest. And now you're telling me you may hit $6 a gallon in Mississippi?
Yeah, well, what we shared, Lars, I'm sure you know, is that the reports are that the first time in our history, the average is above $4 in all 50 states. So on the way into the studio here this morning, every sign I saw was north of $4, usually $4.9, $4.19. And that's mainly because, as you know, Lars, our fuel taxes, our state taxes are relatively low. I think we're next to last of all the 50
God
states.
Bless Mississippi for that.
And we've managed to keep that in effect because it's been a rather contentious issue, political issue here in the state of Mississippi, whether or not to increase the fuel taxes. As you can imagine, there are some who benefit from an increase in fuel taxes because that money goes directly to our state highway fund, and they advocate for that. But the taxpayers say, we're taxed enough. We got enough here. Let's get our act in order. So you know how that works out. It's very controversial. But right now, I guess we have amongst the lowest average price in the country. Though north of $4 doesn't feel like a low average price, of course. Nobody has ever done that in Mississippi and across the country. The Biden administration, we were just talking, as you probably heard, Lars. So what do they do? Go with hat in hand to Venezuela?
And
help me out here.
Arab Emirates as well. They're trying to open that one up. Imagine this.
Yeah.
Joe Biden would rather have dictator oil from Venezuela than free people oil from the United States.
It's unbelievable. So around these parts, it is thought that it is actually estimated, and I think it's fairly accurate estimates. It comes from the oil and gas industry that we can produce oil out of the Gulf, I think, safely. We talked about this yesterday on the show. We have way better technology than we ever have, and protocols and procedures in place to guard against any sort of mishap. But we can produce it for $30 a barrel out of the Gulf here.
Well, and Gerard, think about this. I know that a lot of people say, but what about that underwater, the Deepwater Horizon, the blowout? And I kept reminding people at the time, we've got 4,000 platforms, I think is the current number, out in the Gulf. And so if you apply the standards, if we have 4,000 platforms and one has a blowout, and blowouts are relatively rare and they're relatively short-lived, that one was an exception. It would be like saying every time you have one of those chain reaction collisions on the highway and 10 or 20 people get in an accident, and oftentimes, sometimes people die, that you would say, well, then we should ban car travel altogether on that basis because it's too dangerous, because occasionally there is a catastrophe. Would you apply that to any other part of your life, to trains, to planes, to automobiles? I wouldn't.
It just seems like that every reaction, every approach that comes from the left is one that involves a hammer. It never involves a surgical scalpel, if you will. It's always a hammer. And you look, it's pivoting a bit here, but if you look at this horrific incident in Buffalo, because of this one idiot, this one deranged, demented, hateful fool that goes in and plays shoot 'em up, all of a sudden, everybody on the right is responsible for that, including those of us in the talk show business, right? We're the reason he went and did that. It's just
let me give you a couple of thoughts on Buffalo, because Joe Biden went there to make political hay yesterday. Do you know where he still has not gone? There was a terrible hate crime in Waukesha, Wisconsin. A black man who apparently didn't like white people drove right down the middle of the street and plowed down a bunch of people in a Christmas parade, most of them white. And that was a hate crime. Joe Biden, to this day, has still not visited Waukesha. The second thing to know about the Buffalo murderer, I don't want to call him a shooter. A shooter is a guy like me who goes to the range and shoots paper targets, or occasionally goes out and shoots a deer or an elk. But this is not a shooter. This is a killer, and he ought to be convicted and he ought to be put to death. But having said that, when you read his whole diatribe, he hated everybody. He hated Jews. He hated black people. He didn't like the administration. He didn't like government. I mean, the list of people this guy hated was as long as your arm. But Joe and the media want to make it sound like it's pure just black and white. And let me point out, too, there was a shooting in a place called Laguna Woods, California. It was at a church. And I'll admit, I was born in Taiwan because my mom and dad were in the U.S. Navy, and my dad was deployed at that time, and my mom went to join him. She was out of the Navy by then, so I was born in Taiwan. I love that little country. It is a freedom. It is the free China, a freedom-loving country that is amazingly prosperous, and they stand up against the big bully of communist China. The Chi-Coms would like to destroy Taiwan. So what does this guy do? The guy who's been arrested, he has a right to his day in court, but he's a Chinese immigrant from mainland China who emigrated to the United States, apparently brought his hatred with him, and goes to a church full of Taiwanese Presbyterians and murders 5 people. Now, does Joe Biden mention that hate crime, which was one Chinese person attacking other Chinese people from Taiwan because of his hatred for Taiwan? Joe Biden doesn't even mention that one. He doesn't mention Waukesha. He doesn't mention many of the other hate crimes that have been committed by other people. Hate crimes come in every color. They come in every gender. They come in every sexual preference. But Joe Biden and the Democrats only want to talk about the ones that make political hay for them.
It's I don't know if you caught Megyn Kelly's podcast, Lars. We talked about it yesterday. I mean, it got her fired. If she came out of her seat, she got so enraged. And what she said was, good grief, can't we just take a minute to grieve the situation? Human life was lost. It was butchered. It was destroyed by another human. Can't we just soak that in and take a respite and grieve? No. Immediately, we had to go out and politicize it. And I hate to say it, Lars, but it's like, well, the jackpot was hit. It was a white supremacist that went in and murdered black people. Oh, it's like the jackpot. They won the lottery. The only thing that's better is if it had been a white cop.
And Gerard, the thing we should be asking, which is not politicizing it, we should be saying the police knew about this guy a year ago. The police took this guy into custody and took him down for a mental health evaluation. He was cleared. New York State has these crazy red flag laws, which I think are a violation of due process, and they have a lot of other problems. But did they use the red flag law in this case to say this guy's crazy? Did the FBI, which manages, they can tell you chapter and verse on all 700 people who were at the Capitol on January the 6th, who got arrested and charged with crimes, some of which they did commit. I'll admit that. But did the FBI monitor this guy? Because the warning signs were all over his social media, and they had the heads up that he'd already been arrested for making threats against its school. So it's like the FBI manages to miss every time. You know the list of all the things the FBI, the Pulse nightclub shooting, all these other situations where the FBI knew what was going on or had good reason to have taken fair warning. And they should have looked at this guy's social media. And apparently, if they'd been watching it, we now learned this morning that 30 minutes before he began shooting and killing people and live streaming it from a camera on his helmet, he told people, this is what I'm going to go do. So if they'd been watching this character, they would have had 30 minutes of warning, and he'd already been spotted at the store. A security guard walked up to him while he was casing the place within the last couple of months and asked, what are you doing here, and why do you keep walking in and out of the store? How many warnings does law enforcement, and specifically the FBI, need? Or are they too busy going out and tracking parents who show up at school board meetings and get too loud?
It's that and developing new pronoun policies, I guess. It seems like we're so misguided in the things that we consider to be priority relative to what should be priorities. Just never make it. I know you're busy. Can you hang for another segment, Lars?
Sure, I can do that. I'm just hanging here in the studio with my buddy Winston. I remind you, Winston is he's a son of Pontotoc. So my big
That's
burner,
right.
Bernese Mountain Dog is from Pontotoc, and he's glad to say
That's
hi
awesome.
to his friends in Mississippi.
That's awesome. Lars Larson, host of the Lars Larson Show, is our guest on Middays. We're in the Element Well studios. We'll be right back. Segment here on Middays. Lars Larson is our guest. So, Lars, in prepping for the show, I on a daily basis, I filter through a number of the major media publications in the country, newspapers in particular. So
they're good for a laugh.
Exactly. New York Post, which is, of course, a different deal altogether, but
like
very entertaining. Post. Yeah, the Post is great. But the Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, L.A. Times, I read that. But the one that sticks out to me is by far the most left-wing and the most filled with hyperbole is the Boston Globe. The Boston Globe is off the charts, but they and so I take it in the form of a newsletter, in my email, and then I just pick the articles I want to read. Anyhow, the one yesterday, every now and then they'll send one at the end of the day, and the subject, and they call it fast forward, by the way, and the subject of this particular one is, quote, "This is us, a murderous country." So they have this article in there that I scrolled down and read. It's a pretty short little piece and basically says we might as well just accept that nothing is going to change as long as we keep voting in Republicans who are in thrall and indebted to the NRA. It's just incredible.
Listen, this is coming from the Hate America crowd. This is the crowd that 20 years ago said 9/11 was our fault, that we got attacked by terrorists. This is the crowd that hates America on a regular basis. They're not crazy about the military, and they hate the country. They hate the very idea of the country. I guess what you have to accept, I think, is that if you live in a country with abundant freedoms, and Gerard, one of the favorite things I do with audience, the listeners, especially on First Amendment Fridays, is I say to them, can you name another country on planet Earth that affords its citizens the kind of freedoms that we have? And then on top of that, can you name a country that says those freedoms are unalienable because they came to us from God, and that the purpose of the Constitution is to keep the government from taking them away? If you give any large group of people freedoms, sadly, Gerard, you know this, in any population of people, you're going to find some thieves, you're going to find some cheats, you might find some violent people. But the only way to stop that, I guess, is to go what the Democrats, I think, want, some of them, is they want a lockdown authoritarian government, which they tried out over the last 2 years. And they found out an awful lot of Americans have said, pound sand, we're not doing that. But they seem to desire to live in an authoritarian government, because other than that, I mean, I'm sure you don't have a lot of mass murders in China, but then again, do you want to live as a Chinese subject under the thrall of the Chi-Com government?
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because you're so right, Lars. But Chuck Todd over there at NBC, he said Republicans are using the First Amendment to, quote, appease the white supremacist movement. Nope. So if you're for us being a sovereign nation with closed borders and some degree of regulated, effective and reasonable immigration, well, then you're a white supremacist and you caused this nut to go murder people. That literally is what they're saying. That's the replacement theory. Lars, I never even heard of that till this week. I didn't know what it was.
And Gerard, just like you, I sample an awful lot of media, dozens of newspapers, dozens of websites, and I read both sides. I read the left and the right. The left, actually reading the left is a great way to find show topics, because you're not going to believe the crazy stuff they're saying now. But when you do all that, you usually get exposed to at least most of the ideas, even the crazy ideas out there. And I had never heard of replacement theory. And the fact is, if somebody came to me and said, I'm worried about replacement theory, I'd say, well, we're a country that's about 68% white. and about 32% people of color. And we're all to be treated equally under the law and under the Constitution. So if you're worried that demographically, at some point, you could talk to a demographer, and they could probably tell you at some point, white people may not be a majority. Who cares, as long as we're all treated equally? Now, if you live in the Democrat world, where you can never be equal enough, it's like Animal Farm, where all the animals were equal, some were just more equal than others, which is what the Democrats, and as a conservative, you don't have to make this up or read between the lines. All you have to do is look at what they say. They call it equity. And equity means you don't judge people based on, as Dr. King called it, the content of their character, but you judge them on the color of their skin. Say you have pink skin or white skin, therefore you're an oppressor. You have brown or black skin, you are the oppressed. And that's baked into the cake. And we need to have the government come in and impose equity, which does not mean the best man or woman gets the job or gets the spot in whatever profession they want to be in. You do it based on a checkbox, like the Biden administration has done. We have an affirmative action hire in the vice president.
Yeah.
We had an affirmative action choice for the Supreme Court. You had a real prize of an affirmative action choice over at Health and Human Services.
Oh,
and we've all seen pictures of him. And you understand, that's what equity looks like. We don't have to imagine it. It's right there in front of us.
Lars, couldn't you reasonably conclude that, well, maybe it's those sorts of actions and inaction on the border, maybe that's what drove this fool to go murder others? You could conclude that reasonably.
Of course,
but yet
Gerard,
they hang it on us.
One of the flaws, though, and I've been covering murders as a reporter. I covered courts and cops for a couple of decades, and so I ended up interviewing some of the most execrable people in the world: mass murderers, serial killers, rapists. I mean, really horrible people, right? But if you look at this and people say, well, I wonder why he did that. I said, trying to apply logic and trying to apply some kind of rationale to inherently irrational acts is really kind of a fool's errand, I think, because you're trying to say, well, there must be some reasonable explanation. He was worried about border control, which, by the way, last month we hit a brand new all-American record of 234,000 people encountered by the Border Patrol, tens of thousands that the Border Patrol never saw, more tens of thousands what they call gotaways, where they saw them but never got to actually write them that little piece of paper saying, would you please show up at court and
give them a phone,
which ain't going to happen. Yeah, but I resist the notion of trying to take the Ted Bundys of the world or the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world and saying there must have been a logical reason that Dahmer liked to capture people, kill them, and eat them. No, there is no logic. There is no rationale to an irrational act.
Well, when Senator Mike Braun of Indiana was questioned by one of the left-wing outlets, what should we do about this sort of hate-filled, racial-motivated terrorism and heinous acts, he actually said something about that. Well, maybe we need to be better at detecting mental health conditions and treating those. And they excoriated him for saying that because he didn't fall in line and say, well, we've just got to take all the guns off the street. We've got to ban free speech. We've got to stop this replacement theory rhetoric on talk radio and TV. I mean, he didn't fall in line. Imagine that. He said, well, maybe there's a short circuit in the brain that needs to be discussed.
Well, a couple of things about that. Number one, violent crime in America, and I want everybody to remember this number, please. It comes from the Crime Prevention Research Center. I happen to serve on the board of directors, but I'm uncompensated, so I got no other dog in the fight than that. They point out that out of all the violent crime in America, 8% of it is committed with a gun or using a gun. The other 92% of violent crime in America is committed without guns, with other instruments, and sometimes with just bare fists. So you have to think that even if the liberals got their wish and they managed to erase every gun from private ownership, which would not take them out of the hands of criminals, because we know that because there are countries where it's virtually illegal for a private citizen to own a gun, and the criminals still have guns. So that's problem one. But even if you did that and it addressed the 8% of violent crime, it doesn't address the rest of it. And he's right about the mental health care. And frankly, while I'm for freedom and I don't like the idea of the government surveilling people, if you were to use, like you said, you go to websites, if somebody says, hey, there's this crazy guy and he's got a website, is there any prohibition on you going and taking a look at his website, seeing what he's saying, maybe even talking about it on the radio and saying to your audience, this guy's crazy, and this is what he's saying? When Buffalo, New York police became aware of this kid, and they had to know, if they checked, that he had purchased weapons, he bought some more, he was 18 years old, and if they became aware of that, at what point would it be flawed for the police to say, hey, and the FBI to say, let's keep an eye on this guy's social media.
Yeah,
and when
at a minimum,
really crazy stuff. Now, remember, when I put something on Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, all the other sites that are out there, and we're on all of them. When I put something up there, I intend it for public consumption.
Yeah,
when this crazy kid
so it's public at that point.
Media,
I agree.
What's that?
I agree. It's public at that point. We got to go. You're right, bro, Lars. Appreciate it, man. See you soon.
Take care, Gerard.